And these are short discussions to spark ideas. And I'm joined by Efna Owens and Julie Malloy. And today we want to talk about making good with what you've got. So, just a bit of context before we dive into a chat. The idea here is that we all sort of separately been interested in how often when we're working in the cultural sector, there's a desire to do lots of new things, to build new things, to work in new ways. And that's all fantastic energy and innovation, but particularly at a time when we're all struggling and funding is hugely limited. Is that really what's needed? Is there a different approach? And we really want to just get our teeth into what's a better way of reusing what we're doing. And we're talking about physical spaces, but we're also talking about ways of working. We're talking about how we might work more with our audiences. So really it's a sort of quite aspirational discussion about how the sector could do more with what they've got, but also what are the challenges around that. So I'm going to just start with the basics. So what you both think the problem is. So can you define a problem here from your perspective? So Efna, do you want to give us your perspective first?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot because I have spent the last 20 years at the kind of capital project end of the cycle, I guess. So planning, designing, usually new build projects, but if not new build, then big refurbishment. And I think the thing I've become really aware of and that I've taken a lot of time over the past year to reflect on is just this fact that addicted is probably wrong, but we've had, I think what people in my generation of museum makers maybe have lost sight of is we've had an unprecedented phase of capital projects. So from the kind of late 90s to today. And I think it's kind of really given us a mindset that the way to fix museums or to meet the needs of audiences is to build something new, is to, throw an architect at it, throw a lot of money at it, build a new wing, refurbish it. And obviously in some cases that is necessary. But I think it's got us out of the habit of asking some very fundamental questions about what is the project for? Why are we actually doing this? And we've also, I think, seen projects, big capital projects, which were intended to address a problem, fix a problem. And actually, we're now seeing that they haven't worked, or that there's been a more fundamental issue. And it wasn't about building a shiny new wing after all. It was actually about probably doing other kinds of work to connect better with audiences. So like I said, I think it's been it's been a crazy 20 years or so. And I think, as you were saying, the funding just isn't there anymore. And I think that's not great in so many ways, but if it forces us to have a bit of a mindset shift, I think that's probably a very timely change that needs to happen.
Yeah, and there's a lot in there about sort of intention, that absolute best will in the world. This is on the surface about helping audiences and doing more with our collections, but there is a sort of sense that everyone that gets their teeth into a new opportunity sort of wants to leave a legacy, wants to leave their mark, wants to be remembered for something, and that often can lead to slightly different decisions. Julie, what's your perspective, especially from being in-house for a long time? What do you feel about this idea of doing more with what you've got in front of you?
Well, yeah, I mean, in terms of my history, I think I've only ever really been connected to large organisations where capital projects have been seen as that sort of silver bullet, if you like. But increasingly over my career, I think that I've now got to a point where actually being much clearer from a leadership point of view about the purpose of your organization, why you exist and who you exist for, is actually fundamentally more appropriate than just building and hope that they will come. And actually, from a leadership point of view, I think so many organizations, certainly what I'm finding now in this stage of my career, so many organizations are actually quite unclear about what that purpose is and really struggle to define it. And for me, that's the sort of legacy principle, is being really clear about why you exist and who you want to serve. So and actually that doesn't mean throwing large amounts of cash at it. I suppose that now in my career, I think I'm finding that the reality of the situation is, as you said, cash is tight, but actually also resources are very tight, and I mean people. And so being that sort of fundamentally clear about what you're trying to achieve with the team that you have, is clearly, I think, the most important thing in terms of progressing what you stand for.
Mm. And I suppose it's quite interesting because a lot of smaller organizations seem to be talking about the honest reality of let's merge, let's see how we can sort of share content departments. Can we do more with less? A lot of smaller organizations are thinking like that, not necessarily yet able to do it. But do you think, given how stretched the sector is, there is an argument for scaling back rather than growing at this point?
Absolutely agree with that. I think I work with so many organizations where they just overcomplicate everything.
Mm.
So simplification for me is the answer. Doing less. It's a sort of much cliched phrase, but doing less, much better, and actually being clear what better looks like.
Mm.
I do feel sympathy for museums, though, because in the same period of growth, like so many parts of the public sector, there's so much pressure on museums to be, a public service that does all things for everybody. And that they are under pressure to demonstrate, that they're achieving learning results, that they're, helping with social cohesion, that, there's so many things. And as you said, Julie, from a resource point of view, museums are incredibly stretched. They're struggling to keep the lights on, and so I think there is this feeling of, oh, we're supposed to be doing this, that, and the other. So that message of focusing just on a few things and doing them really well, I think that's completely valid. But I think it's quite hard for museums to kind of own that and
Yep.
to defend it as well, because I think they're under a lot
Yeah.
of pressure
Yeah.
from funders to demonstrate, just how valuable they are in order just to get their basic funding.
Exactly. And I think that actually the sort of whole route of statutory funding is one of the challenges. And, the bodies that are sitting in the background supporting museums are often not necessarily aligned in what those objectives should be. So I think it is a really confusing picture if you're reliant on funding and your statutory funders have so many particular criteria, and they are often at odds with other funding bodies. So I think it makes it really it's a puzzling phase to be in, actually.
Mm. I mean, as a bit of a reality check, can we collectively figure out how much investment is actually going into new museums, new culture, new sort of big picture initiatives versus sort of keeping the doors open? Do we have a sense at the moment about how much that's actually happening? I'm especially thinking, there's been identified priority places by Arts Council. There's a couple of sort of major new projects on the go at the moment. But do we think growth is continuing? Do you think we stalled? Have you got a sense of that? Ethna, what have you seen from projects that are on live at the moment?
This is anecdotal rather than published evidence because nobody's publishing this, but certainly what I have heard is that the money for capital projects has shrunk. Is that the right word? It's dwindled. It's just not there.
Mm.
There are a few high-profile capital projects, but the kind of word on the street is if there's a big capital project, good luck to you because you're going to have something really out of the ordinary. The need has to be so demonstrable. Like, why have we not had this before? Clearly, we need one of these. We're hearing from the government pretty much every day that the money isn't there. So the money really isn't there. And yeah, it's a difficult time because also the money isn't there just for the operational side of things either. So, like I said, it's anecdotal, but that's certainly what I'm hearing.
Mm. I mean, I suppose there are some nice positive stories where things are happening. I was involved very lightly with the Berwick Barracks project up in Berwick upon Tweed, and that was quite inspiring as an example for me because that is trying to be a big capital project, but they're very strongly working with existing local organisations to realise it. So that's a nice example of yes, it's going to involve a lot of money, but it's very much grounded in operationally. It's got to be run by the people that are already there for the people that are already there and be part of a kind of bigger tourism piece. So there are, I think, some good examples of where the intention is sort of well aligned.
And I think there are projects and people who, you know, again, going back to this thing about need and purpose, who have really identified a need, who are working really creatively with partners to think about how they can harness existing resources, and who have just that determination to see something through. So I don't mean to suggest there won't be any, but I think in terms of the volume, and the other big factor in the sector, I suppose, is that what was then the Heritage Lottery Fund, and now I can never think of the new acronym, the National Lottery Heritage Fund, so the NHLF, was such a reliable source, I guess, of funding for major capital projects. And, annually we're giving out millions of pounds, and they are still funding projects, but not to the same extent. And again, that was a real pipeline of work. And it wasn't, of course, that they funded everything, and they were rigorous in what they would fund and the process that you had to go through. But that was quite a reliable source for organizations to say, well, we have a big project, we'll apply to the lottery. There's a decent chance that we will get this big capital project funded. And that just isn't the case anymore.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose one thing that struck me, and thinking about the kind of experience that's being offered as well. So sort of Julie, I know you do a lot of work in guest experience, but that when I've had really powerful cultural experiences lately myself, they have tended to be places that are either brand new. So my example is always Naturalis, which I know Ethne you worked on, which I just absolutely love in Leiden, brand new museum that was just the most extraordinary approach to, a museum experience, but also somewhere like the Burrell, so, major redevelopment, and the Burrell collection was just fantastic as a museum. But these are both places where they've had tons of money spent on them. So again, a bit of a reality check for us, how can organizations compete with doing better with what they've got when actually what audiences want are these experiences that have had vast amounts of money spent on them? Julie, what's your perspective on that?
I don't know the solution to that. I mean, I think I tend to agree with you that certainly over the last couple of years, I mean, you and I rave about Depot in Rotterdam. And for me, that is an extraordinary building and gives a great experience. And it really is an incredibly new way at looking at collections with an organisation that clearly is quite well funded in order to be able to build that big capital project. I think it is a really hard, competitive world, but I also believe that actually there are some really extraordinary. We've talked about the Story Museum in Oxford, who are really operate on a small scale, but are delivering really satisfactory experiences for a very, very targeted audience. And I think it does come back to that: is that often museums, don't even have any sense of who they're trying to talk to, and so actually being really clear and really actually being quite specific about what audiences you're targeting do often help you deliver that great experience to perhaps a small proportion of the audience or your community. And I think that actually from what I've researched about the Story Museum, it feels as though it's sort of harnessing that properly. I think the challenge with just going back to the my experience of nationals is they sort of are very unclear about who it is they're trying to target, and they try and results target everyone and then fail to do that. And you can do that with or without a big capital project. Interestingly enough, I was yesterday at a large venue in the middle of London, which had a capital project which was completed at vast expense prior to the pandemic. I was there at lunchtime yesterday, and it's a massive footprint in the heart of the West End, and I could have been on my own.
Right. Yeah.
So that to me suggests that a lot of it was slightly vanity rather than actually having a sole purpose to attract new or even widen your audience pool.
Ethne, what's your perspective? Because I know you've got some strong feelings about this idea of sort of repurposing and transforming rather than building. What does good look like to you?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you pulled out Naturalis, which I worked on, but also the Burrell, which I worked on. The master plan phase. Yeah, okay. So I think the Burrell is a really interesting example. And I mean, yeah, it would be disingenuous to say there wasn't a major capital project. There was, because it was driven by the fact that the fabric of the building was failing. I mean, the roof was leaking. That was pretty problematic when you've got a priceless art collection. And then there was the opportunity of essentially fixing the building was an opportunity to also address some other issues because the audience was declining, there was issues of accessibility. So yeah, it was a major capital project. But I think what's really interesting for me anyway about the borough as it is now, as it's being reopened, is what has happened is that all of the qualities that were there before, the kind of ingredients that made it such a beloved institution in Glasgow previously, that's what's being preserved, that's what's being amplified. So, you know, beautiful architecture, the whole idea of the walk in the woods, so that there's this phenomenal gallery with huge floor to ceiling windows looking out into the parkland, and people absolutely adore that. And that hasn't changed. I mean, essentially, you could almost go into that gallery today. An architect or an engineer will appreciate there's the flooring, the ventilation, the insulation, it's all improved, but it's kind of almost invisible mending because those qualities that were there before have absolutely been kept. A lot of the original showcases, the art, obviously, and even kind of what you would think of as more contemporary interpretation. For example, the use of media is very subtle. And so for me, even though there was a major capital project involved, it really is about that attitude of saying, what do we have that really works? What do people love about this? What do they respond to? And that's what I would always counsel museums and clients that I'm working with to do, is basically think about how awesome what you have is. Often the buildings are really special and create a special atmosphere that people love to be in. Yes, they can have issues around accessibility and environmental control, and those need to be addressed. But I think it's just really celebrating that and celebrating the collections and really being proud of those, I suppose, and understanding that those are incredible assets, so that whatever you're doing should be focused on those amazing things, not trying to compete with, for example, immersive experiences, which, you know, are tech driven and require huge budgets, and they're doing something and people love them, but that's something very different. And I think museums should just be, I say just, it's not easy, I know, but I think it's about celebrating the qualities you have.
Mm.
Do you agree that they've achieved that at the Portrait Gallery? Because I do think that the recent work of the Portrait Gallery absolutely supports what you've said. It's such an improved experience, both in terms of how you, you know, from the guest journey point of view, it's such an improved experience. But also, actually, they've just heightened the experience of being in that extraordinary collection.
Mm. And I think it's interesting because actually, as you're speaking, I was also reflecting on the fact that if we take the borough, my experience, it was just very complete. So rather than there being one showcase thing like the exhibition or some clever new digital, everywhere I went, I was being presented the collection in a different way that was making me think, but it all felt sort of very complimentary. And exactly like you're saying, Julie, about Portrait Gallery and other places, the welcome was very warm, you know, everything made sense. So you know, I say that it was the one place where as I left I deliberately went to go and donate, which is actually quite unusual because normally I've been to the cafe or I've bought something in the shop, and here I thought I haven't spent any money, I need to give them some money. So I think there's something about that sort of cohesion being vital. And Julie, I know you've talked a lot about this, but in terms of sort of investing to improve, if people were going to invest in anything, maybe it's more about that sort of sense of cohesion amongst the team, amongst the experience. Do you have any other thoughts on that?
I mean, I think investment in people is clearly a really important factor, specifically around, you know, delivering them that great guest experience, but also, and that doesn't need to be, you know, huge financial investment. That can be, you know, really secure work around purpose and structure and goals and objectives. And I think that actually investment in your people, very often, I think the cultural sector is quite patchy at that.
Mm.
And often doesn't actually value completely the workforce that it has.
Yeah. Yeah, and arguably still lots of silos internally between departments, that collections is different to front of house is different to commercial. And actually that's going to come across to an audience member. They don't care who's running it, but they're going to notice if it all feels disconnected.
Absolutely disjointed. Yeah, I absolutely, I do agree with that. And you know, and often I can be working with organizations where, you know, it's even really rare for teams to get in the same room together for any length of time. And so it's hardly surprising, unless that sort of leadership core is really strong, it's hardly surprising that they're, incredibly task driven, to deliver on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to be thinking about how, guest or audience focused they should be.
And if we think about that a bit more, about the audience perspective, but also this idea of what leadership should be focusing on. And, everyone does want to leave a positive legacy. And Julie, I think I'm quoting you back, that legacy can be a greater impact on the community. It doesn't have to be an acquisition or, a new building or whatever it is. But what do you think is the legacy the leaders should be leaving, and what should their priority be at the moment? Ethne, if it were you, what would you be doing if you were in charge?
I mean, and I realize this is so much easier said than done, but I think it's about creating spaces where people want to be, that offer them something that they're not getting in other places. I am still a passionate advocate for the role of museums in society. I waxed lyrical recently in a piece I wrote about the Miffy Museum in the Netherlands. This is a kind of a what if this was your first museum, and this notion that you learn about spaces that are full of inspiring ideas, they make your world bigger. That can be such a valuable asset. Again, I think we forget sometimes what an amazing resource a museum can be. And I think it's about focusing in on that. And I think I am also a huge advocate of museums cannot be all things to everybody. And it's when you try to be all things to everybody that things start to fall apart. But I do think oftentimes a museum can also have a very valuable role in instilling a sense of pride in a community and giving them something to feel. Again, it's a little bit outside your everyday experience. It's not school, it's not work, it's not home. It's this truly special place. And I think giving, sort of, again, amplifying that, giving people a sense of pride, making them feel welcome, if you can do that, it's so important.
Yeah. And actually, that's really lovely to hear you say that, because I realized recently how much time I spend in my museum in St Albans, in their town hall and gallery museum, which has had a recent refurbishment. But what's fascinating is it's the whole space just feels welcoming. I always drop into the shop where there are local makers. I'm proud to take people to the cafe because it's really cool, because it's in an old courtroom. I talk about the fact my family, my dad played guitar there, my grandma had art there. It's got a local connection, but they have found ways for me to feel able to talk about that. And it's such a shining example. And St Albans is a very popular place. It gets tons of visitors and they benefit from having had money, but they're doing good with that money. And it's about how it makes me feel. It's not about how the place looks. So that, for me, I'd never really thought about it, about how much time I spend there, but it's a perfect example. Julie, what's your thoughts? What would be the legacy and priority right now?
For me, in a leadership role, actually, I think more generally, I think in this specific climate, I think being able to ensure a legacy of sustainability is really important. And so many, particularly in small organisations, are really struggling from that point of view. That I think the leadership responsibility is to build, however you can, a model that is financially sustainable for the future. I absolutely do agree with you both that instilling that sort of sense of pride, and actually, Kate, you said it, the way an organisation makes you feel, or a space makes you feel, I think is wholly important. And you can do that, but you've also got to make sure that you're there. Your legacy has got to be sustainability, I believe, at the moment. Interestingly enough, I have the same feeling. I've recently moved to Suffolk, and I'm quite near to a town called Sudbury, which is the old silk weavers' town, and it was where Gainsborough was born, and they had the Gainsborough House Museum, which did also undertook a large capital project throughout COVID, frankly, and it has been a huge success. And it's really sort of defined the area. I wish many more visitors. Unlike St Albans, nobody actually just drops into Sudbury. But actually, I do feel as though when I have visitors up here, it's the first port of call because it delivers an extraordinary experience. It's a high quality collection. It's architecturally really important. The way that the extension that they've built fits seamlessly onto the historic building is just that. It's seamless and it makes lots of sense. It's been really brilliantly planned by the architect and designers, and I get that sense of civic pride. And I've only lived here for about 12 months, so actually I think these places can do that for you, and they should.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, although we have spoken a lot about sort of bigger developments, you know, some of these organizations we're talking about are regional, they're smaller. You know, actually some of the funding was quite a while ago now, and yet they've still places that draw us. So I think it is also about reassuring people that that sentiment about how things feel and how things are interconnected internally is possible to achieve without spending millions of pounds. Well, thank you both so much. It was fascinating. And obviously, we welcome everyone else's perspective on this. So we'll share online and get your thoughts, and we can carry on the conversation elsewhere. So thank you so much.
Thank you.